firmly affirming the resolution that the proliferation of theory in high school parliamentary debate does more harm than good. First, we're going to go into some definitions. Proliferation is the fact of something increasing a lot and suddenly in number or amount. In this case, we're going to say it's the spread of theory in parliamentary debate. We are going to define high school parliamentary debate as what we are all doing here today. Hopefully that's cool with everyone. And we are going to define today's round as a fact round as implied by does more harm than good in the resolution. We are going to define theory as a body of arguments operating outside the frame of the resolution pertaining to how debate should be debated. So this is including but not limited to things like topicality, critiques, pick bad or good theory, anything relating to topics about how debate should be debated. Yeah, sure.
Can you just repeat that definition one more time?
A body of arguments operating outside the frame of the resolution pertaining to how debate should be debated, I guess in any topic other than this one, because in this one the case is about how debate should be debated.
So what about the proliferation of nuclear weapons is especially sudden or rapid as per your definition of proliferation?
Perfect. Nuclear weapons came onto the scene immediately. They were not something that had existed for a very long time, and then once they came onto the scene, they spread in the last 20 years of or last couple decades of history very quickly. But that definition comes from Merriam-Webster. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get into our case. Our first contention is that of exclusion. Subpoint A here is going to be inaccessible. Theory comes into parliamentary debate in a way that is only accessible for schools that are versed in theory. Essentially, this means that new schools that do not have a background in theory, schools with less resources or schools with less coaching, are completely excluded from using theory in parliamentary debate. It acts in a way that excludes people because it has all this jargon, it has all these words that people don't know what they mean, it has all these complex ideas that are developed on the internet and through debate through long periods of time that are simply not accessible to individuals who are new to parliamentary debate or do not have resources, extensive resources in parliamentary debate. This means that it inherently favors schools that have long-standing reputations in parliamentary debate, which is unfair, instead of favoring schools that are, and it excludes schools and discourages new schools from joining parliamentary debate. The second subpoint here is going to be less resources. Theory inherently comes from having a lot of resources. Having the ability to take time to write Ks, to learn about these different things, instead of simply learning about the basics of debate, learning about different topics, learning about how to argue. Theory inherently takes resources, which means that schools with less resources are going to have less access to theory. And this is problematic because theory is not something that can go, I'll take it in a second, that can go one way. Once theory is introduced into a round, the other team has to respond to it, or the other team will say that they lose on theory, and most judges are willing to let that happen. If you fail to respond to theory or don't know how to respond to theory, you are going to lose the round in a vast majority of cases. I'll take it at the end of this advantage. The third point here is going to be silencing the first speaker. So we can see that each team in parliamentary debate, in theory, and this is applying specifically to critiques, which are particularly pervasive in terms of theory. Each team should have 19 minutes to speak and 20 minutes of prep time. Speech times have altered a little bit, but that's about right. The problem is here that when theory happens, something like a K being read in the second speech or something that completely derails the round, you effectively silence the first speech, meaning that that team, the affirmative team, did not have any of their prep time. It wasn't worth it anymore because now they're talking about theory, and they lost access to that speech time, which makes the rounds inherently unfair, which means we're not debating about substance. We don't have an equal round here. We have a round that is based on your resources, your background, and how much access you had to theory, which is unfair. It's not a good way for to have high school parliamentary debate. Our second contention is going to be education. The first subpoint here is going to be content. Obviously, when you spend time talking about theory, you're not talking about content. You've heard every debater make this in every round that has theory, because when you are talking about theory, you lose out on the content of the debate, which means that instead of learning about what the fixation of prices of the Chinese yuan is, you're learning about what the definition of the fixation of prices of the Chinese yuan is, which is inherently less educational. You're saying the same arguments back and forth at each other. You're talking about these really intricate inside baseball rules of debate, which are not applicable to other scenarios in life, and you lose out on a huge amount of education pertaining to the actual subject area of the topics, which is the entire point of debate. We are here to learn, to grow as individuals, to grow especially as high schoolers in the world as we progress. Yeah.
So you talked about like a debate over definitions being uneducational. However, one of the definitions of math is 2 equals 2. If I can't get that definition straight, then how do I proceed with the rest of math?
So I'm going to get into that, but essentially definitional debates in debate, first of all, that's not the only form of theory. We're talking about critiques and other things here, but definitional debates in debate typically take away from talking about content, which is more important and outweighs. The second point here is going to be for the real world. None of the jargon and theory that any of us learned in debate is going to help us outside a debate round. It simply will not. If we instead learn more about how to make valuable arguments, how to think about the world, about different policies that are enacted into place, about different real world issues, that can help us in our lives. That can help kids going forward. That is going to be applicable in the future. Learning about theory is not applicable in the future. It's only applicable in debate. So it is less valuable than other kinds of education that occur in debate. The third point here is going to be parliamentary debate promotes bad theory. If there is such thing as good theory, we know it doesn't happen in a debate form that was explicitly created to exclude it. A debate form that only has 20 minutes for each side to prep, which means that people are taking pre-prepared theory cases, pre-prepared, especially when it comes to critiques, pre-prepared critiques, and just trying to jam them into whatever the resolution in that round is. They are not using them effectively. We do not have to stand up here and tell you today that all theory in parliamentary debate is bad, but just how quickly it is spread and how widely used it is a bad thing for parliamentary debate. And bad theory means that nobody's learning. It means that nobody's taking away even the somewhat value that theory can have, because it's not being run well and not everyone's prepared for it. And most, at least half people who do parley are not prepared for theory. And our third and final contention is that it takes away from parley debate as a whole. The first point here is going to be the origin of parley. Parley was created to be getting away from theory. Essentially, policy was super theory heavy. It was super all these things that made it really exclusive, so people created LD. Well, LD became super theory heavy. It became all these things that made debate exclusive, so people created parley. If we allow theory to be pervasive in parley too, we've undermined the very point of parley existing, which means it's obviously, according to the definition of the resolution, detrimental to parley debate. And the second is going to be about the parley format here. 20 minutes of prep are not conducive to theory, which means that we are destroying the format of parliamentary debate by making it so that it is a debate format where you are prepping large theory cases that can be applied to any round and trying to plug them in. That is not the intention of parley, and it destroys it from the inside out. So for all those reasons, the proliferation of theory in high school parliamentary debate does more harm than good.
There's going to be some cross applications coming back from neg case to on-case positions, but order is going to be framework, ask contentions in order, and then two neg contentions.
There's no framework on the new sheet.
It's not really a new framework, it's just definition debate.
Oh, okay, cool.
Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. My partner and I strongly engage the resolution that the proliferation of theory in high school parliamentary debate does more harm than good. First, on actual weighing mechanism. The weighing mechanism for this round should be preponderance of evidence. Because the affirmation fails to provide a weighing mechanism, we should look at the evidence, which is basically which team provides the most high-quality evidence and analysis to support their position. Okay, we agree that this is a background. Moving on to definitions. In terms of proliferation, they try to define it as inherently being a rapid spread. When you look at other definitions from things such as the Cambridge Dictionary, they don't actually mention the rapid spread element. And we can see the nuclear proliferation actually took a fairly long time, where we can see that, for example, countries such as, let's say North Korea, right? They got nuclear weapons in the late 1900s, early 2000s, whereas the first nuclear weapons tests were conducted in the 1940s. So being rapid isn't inherent to proliferation, but the bigger issue we have with their definitions is where they define theory. They try to define theory as any argument operating outside, a body of arguments operating outside the frame of the resolution pertaining to how debate should be debated. This inherently just doesn't make sense. What we're going to define theory as is theory as procedural a priori arguments, because essentially this is how the high school parliamentary debate views theory, where theory encompasses topicality and encompasses procedural arguments, where these are arguments being made about how norms should operate in debate communities in terms of rules, right? They try to include the critique in terms of theory. The issue with the critique is that the critique isn't an a priori voting issue, right? A lot of the stuff that they mention is talking about how theory is inherently exclusionary and how it's a one-shot kill. We should only be talking about theory in today's debate, because theory is inherently an a priori issue where it's talking about you shouldn't be allowed to do something. The K isn't necessarily an a priori voting issue, and simply critiquing the methods that someone uses, right? Where it's not necessarily always a rhetorical K, right? It can be a K about the plan, right? Where it's not necessarily about how debate should be debated, but the K can also include stuff about how certain mechanisms should be used, like should we use capitalism, right? That's not how debate should be debated. So because this, we really shouldn't include decay in the definition of theory. Okay. Moving on to the affirmations case. So first, on their contention about exclusion, there's a couple of responses here. First response here is that we can see where they talk about how schools can't access theory without having significant resources or coaching, is that the NPDL inherently checks back against this, because we can see that the NPDL publishes numerous free resources online where they're accessible to anybody. Almost every tournament in high school parliamentary debate is affiliated with the NPDL. So as soon as somebody goes to one tournament, they realize, oh, the NPDL is important. Maybe I should check what resources they have. What would they find? Well, among other things, they would find the Parley Prep book written by NPDA debaters giving a thorough overview of theory. So that gives them access to theory. They can find online video recordings of rounds in which debaters debate theory, showing them how the best debaters on the circuit actually evaluate theory. So they can learn from the experience of other schools and other debaters. They can find office hours online in which some of the best debaters from the circuit come back and actually teach people about what people want to know, including theory, for free. So with all these free online resources accessible to everybody, what we can see is that their argument that access to theory is inherently dependent on pre-existing resources or coaching just falls flat. But furthermore, when they talk about theory being exclusionary, I'm actually going to turn this theory is necessary to inclusion, specifically because of the D rule. The D rule is a concept somewhat taken from Lincoln Douglas debate, where what it is that sometimes people should be dropped on theoretical issues, on all priority issues, simply for using exclusionary language or argumentation within the debate space. This is uniquely key to allowing people to access the debate space. A specific example, we can see that at NPDI, I want to say 1 or 2 years ago, Nueva XS, they read theoretical arguments against why teams should not read suicide impacts. They could not access debate spaces in which suicide impacts were read. By reading this theory argument, they were able to access the debate space. Obviously, having more people being able to access the debate space is key to actually having inclusivity. So by saying the theory is bad, and by not giving more people access to theory, we inherently make the debate space exclusionary. Yeah. And in terms of where they're talking about the critique again, first off, critique is key to the access of repressed groups to debate, where we can see that the K originally was used by debaters who were oppressed to actually access the debate space, where they couldn't access the debate space because of inherent constructs of taking advantage of the advantage. And so because of this, we can see that K is actually, again, key to access. We can also see that, as I previously mentioned, K is our theory. I'll take it now.
Never mind.
Okay, perfect. Moving on to contention 2 about topic education. There's a couple of responses here. First, we can see that theory is uniquely key to limiting the debate to the topic at hand. Without theory, we can't limit the debate to what the topic actually is, because they themselves say topicality is a type of theory. We don't have topicality spread across the circuit to all debaters, and we can't give every team the ability to limit the affirmative to the topic, or attempt to limit the affirmative to the topic. With that, if we can't limit teams to the topic, we inherently destroy clash, because the affirmative can prep whatever they feel like, and then the negative can't prep for that. That destroys clash, and clash is key education, because specifically the interaction of arguments is unique to debate and parliamentary debate, and so without clash, we lose the unique education from parliamentary debate, which theory is key to preserving clash. In terms of contention 3, about Parley, when they say Parley was designed to avoid theory, first off, there's another event that avoids theory very well, public forum. Public forum just negates this entire argument. But secondly, we can see that the reasons and the norms of events can change, and this is probably a good thing. For example, for Lincoln Douglas debate for a while, plans simply weren't read in Lincoln Douglas debate. Now it's become a thing where on the national Lincoln Douglas debate circuit, people read plans to enable a more specific debate. So we shouldn't just go with something because it was what the original framers thought. We should go with something because it's actually good for modern debate and modern high school parliamentary debate. This contention just doesn't really matter in the context of today's debate. Moving on to the next 2 contentions. First contention is going to be equity. We can see that ultimately theory is going to remain a part of high school parliamentary debate regardless of what people try to do. We can see that because of, as they mentioned, precursor events to parliamentary debate have it. Lincoln Douglas has it, policy debate has it. We can also see that NPDA has it, and ultimately NPDA is a key part. Yeah, and NPDA, high school parley is following NPDA in things such as the speech time, so we're seeing that we're moving more and more towards norms of event. Gas theory is a key part. We can also see that NPDA provides a large amount of judges for high school parliamentary debate rounds, where those judges, their norms are that they will pick up theory, and we can see that judges don't adapt to high school parliamentary debate norms. Take the TOC, for example. There were massive issues at the TOC where APTA judges didn't adapt to high school parliamentary debate norms. So if judges aren't going to adapt, and NPDA debaters won't adapt, we should have debaters in high school parley know how to appeal to them. We all see that theory is the best way to shape norms and check against abuse because of how it provides a structured method with which to do this, and we're not just arguing back and forth. It provides actual structure under which we can make these arguments. The proliferation of theory is key to equity. Without proliferation, there's unequal access to theory. When there's unequal access to theory, we give some teams the ability to shape norms and deny this access to other teams. Because, as I previously mentioned, NPDA debaters and debaters from other events will vote on theory, what this means that some teams will just lose if theory doesn't proliferate. Yeah, perfect. We can also see that lack of equity is just inherently bad for parliamentary debate. It drives smaller and less resourced schools out of high school parliamentary debate, denies access to many students simply to debate in the first place. By denying access to debate, specifically parley debate, we deny access to parley-specific education on specific topics, and we deny access to education on the whole. The second advantage in today's debate is going to be that of logic. Because about theory is a highly structured form of argumentation, it promotes the effective balancing of resources in teams. The effective evaluation of logical arguments and interdependencies. Because, for example, if I read competing interpretations on a theory shelf, then the other team knows they have to read a counter interpretation as a good strategy before they can actually engage with the shell, right? So instead, by doing theory, we provide a structured form of argumentation in which teams have to be highly logical to engage. This directly promotes the kind of logical thinking which high school parliamentary debate is going to result in. Because ultimately, the education that we get from parley isn't likely to be lifelong, but appreciation for logic and understanding of logic will be, and that's one of the most enduring impacts from high school parliamentary debate, that theory is key actually in resolving. For these reasons, I urge a strong negative ballot. Thank you.
Alright, everyone's ready? I'll get started.
Definitional stuff.
Everyone's ready to get started?
What's the order?
So I'll be starting off
Do
with,
you want to give an on-time roadmap?
I can do it on time.
Time's fine. If you want to do it on time, you can.
Alright, I'm just gonna go definitions, case in order, and then your point in order. Alright, everyone's ready? I'll get started. So right off the top, we're looking at definitional debate. They say that they're going to define, we're fine with their proliferation, that it's the spread. We're just going to point out that the spread of theory in parley has happened relatively quickly. So even if you don't want to put quickly inherently in the definition of proliferation, the reality is the proliferation of theory in parley has happened quickly. So that should still be taken into consideration. If you move on to the definition of theory, they say that this is going to be procedural or a priori arguments only, which means that it excludes case. We're going to specifically argue against this, saying that in the general body of knowledge, when people talk about theory, they're definitely including case. And so in the way that the resolution is framed and meant to encompass, they're definitely encompassing the idea of case debate versus theory debate, which includes in that idea of theory, case in essential, because case are never lumped with case debate or never lumped with lay debate. So you're always going to be seeing that. In addition, we're just going to point out here that they also, throughout their entire case, point out to case as an example of theory that is equitable or that promotes good norms in parliamentary debates. You can't let them have their cake and eat it too. Either case are part of theory, which means that they can try to claim them in their points, or case are not part of theory, so we should drop all of their points that rely on case as responses to us. I'll take it.
So what are some of the case that we supposedly mentioned?
You guys talked about how, in terms of case originally on a response from first contention of less resources, you say case were originally created for groups that felt underrepresented in the debate space and that needed to create a safe debate space, and that was basically a big response there. So you can't either have case are either part of theory and they do good for you, or they're not part of theory and that entire response falls. Basically, without moving to our first point, which is that of inaccessibility. Now, the main response that they bring forth is basically saying that the NPDL checks back against this, and there's all these resources out there for people. The reality situation, though, is that just having these resources theoretically out there is not enough. Number one, this is empirically disproven. We know that schools that don't have a history of theory and who don't have the resources that other big schools do not run theory well and do not know theory. Which means that even if theoretically all these things are out here, we know that empirically it's not enough and it still leads to non-equitable outcomes. Secondly, it's easy to say in the finals round of this tournament to come forth and name all the things that you know is going to work for theory. It's much harder to have like novices who competed at their first tournament today in the novice division and are now gone listening to this round try to come up on their own and just out of the blue pull all these theory things out of the internet after not knowing that they even exist, because like no one is there to tell them that theory is a thing that they should know or to make them aware or to help push them in that direction.
They
So
don't even know the word.
they don't even know like, the word theory or what is encompassed. We're even arguing about the definition here, and we're both two teams that made it to the finals today. It's fair to say that it's not just easy, like, oh, you can just Google it and you'll find all your answers and you'll be as good as a team with like coaches that have been teaching them this for years. It's clear to see that that theory is inaccessible and is exclusionary in rounds. And we know this is true because teams from places like Southern California, the East Coast, and Oregon have historically been like blocked out from tournaments like TOC or MPDI or more theory-heavy tournaments where they feel like they cannot compete, despite sometimes even having like great coaches in their style of parliamentary debate, but because it's not about the topic and because it's so heavily entrenched in jargon and all these things that don't make it accessible, none of which they respond to, by the way, so this should all flow across, shows you that it is completely inaccessible and it's not easy to just say people can just learn it. Then, on the second point about less resources, they try to argue that D rules and the idea of like theory is here to make a debate space for people who don't have that debate space. We're going to argue that this is true. We know that sometimes like there are needs that people need to create a safe debate space for themselves, but the majority of the time, and more importantly, the proliferation of theory that we're talking about here is not about this. Theory does not proliferate so that every single debater could suddenly have like a safe debating environment, because we know that theory proliferated because people were winning and they were able to get away with it and felt like it was something that they could like do and take ballots on. So the proliferation of theory is not referring to like all these like deep rules and the origins of theory. It's the spread since then. We also don't have to defend all theory. We just have to defend in general that the spread has done more harm than good. And so we're saying that sure, maybe there is an occasional piece of theory that has done good, but in the vast aggregate, judges, you all know that the amount of theory that you see, the majority of it, is just to try to win rounds and pick up ballots. With that, we also see no responses absolutely to the idea of silencing the first speaker and silencing prep time. So we can also see there's a lot of there's a lot of like not necessarily like silencing teams that have put in a lot of work that completely flows through, because you're silencing the entire first speech. You're silencing prep time when like you're basically removing the prep time when you run the theory. And all these impacts mean that teams that have spent their prep time studying what they have been coached on are losing all that valuable time, which is skewing the round inherently for the team that has prep. For the team that has theory, which shows that theory is like a tool that is used to win rounds against schools that don't have it. The second point here is going to be about education. They basically say that we need theory in order to limit the scope of the resolution, and you get clash. Again, two responses. The first response to this is going to be that most of the time when theory is done this way, it's not done this way purely to limit the scope of the resolution. Oftentimes teams are trying to win on it. As soon as they see the other, the like affirmative team doing like even a small misstep that could maybe be construed as outside the resolution, they will jump on it in theory because they think that they can win a theory debate against them, and they'll use this as a tool to pick up a ballot. Secondly, more importantly, it skews the entire round. It doesn't just push the round back into a place where you can debate about content, but it pushes the entire round into a spiraling round about theory, which forces everyone to debate on that. So you actually don't get any content from running topicality because you always end up just arguing theory in that round. Secondly, so maybe they say theory. They say that theory just leads to. They don't respond at all to our points. Sorry, they don't respond at all to subpoints B and C, which is that theory doesn't help you in the real world. We don't get any educational value out of theory because you're not necessarily learning about things like China and policy making, which is what we debate like primarily to learn, is about policy decisions and all these important things. And we also flow through subpoint C, which is that we learn bad theory in debate because we just had run canned critiques or canned T-shells that we loosely link into the resolution because we don't have time to properly prepare them in 20 minutes. So you're not seeing any education from the actual theory because of this. Our third point is going to be about taking away issue from parliamentary debate. The only thing they say basically on subpoint A about the origin of parliamentary debate is that LD uses plans, and so it's fine for debate formats to change, but the important point here that they don't respond to is that Parley was made to be a space where we can debate about content rather than theory, and there's other spaces for theory if you want to do that, and by detracting from that, you lose a uniquely key space in which people can debate about content if you introduce theory, and the proliferation of theory loses that in parliamentary debate. They don't respond at all to subpoint B, which is again about prep, which is that and it destroys the point of Parley, which is think on your feet and prep quickly, because if you have unlimited prep to write your theory arguments, you basically destroy the entire purpose of limited prep and learning to write on your feet and research quickly. Moving on to their can. their case, sorry. So their first contention is about equity. They basically just say that judges right now don't want to adapt to parliamentary norms, and there's a lot of NPDA judges. I'll counter that. There's an awful lot of parent judges. In fact, way more parent judges than you have NPDA judges or APTA judges, and parent judges are not at all well versed in theory. So if you're talking about adapting judges, forcing all the parents of like any incoming freshman to slowly over the course of 4 years learn debate theory and jargon just to throw that all away afterwards is much more of a waste of time and is a much more negative impact. And then secondly, they say that proliferation is key to giving everyone access. We know the proliferation of theory, which we are debating about right now, the proliferation, has not given everyone equal access. It has distinguishedly favored more well-off schools in the West Coast, because we know the East Coast of the United States does not have well-versed in theory. SoCal is not, Oregon is not, and even like us, for example, is not. Our opponents come up here and talk about competing interpretations on a T-shell. I don't know what a competing interpretation on a T-shell is. And I've been doing parliamentary debate for 3 years, my friends have been doing it for 4. So we know that the logic that they claim to garner from this type of education is complete bogus. We see that that doesn't happen. Teams don't learn, and instead they face like absolute losses when they lose out to theory. So for all these reasons, the proliferation of theory in high school parliamentary debate has done more harm than good. Thank you.
Everyone ready? All right. Where's the camera? What is one and two? That one? This one? That one?
They're both
This
on.
one? Okay. All right. Cool. Everyone's ready. So my framework, sorry, I'll kind of go back. It's going to be frameworks, followed by next points, followed by app points. Are we all ready? All right. My time begins in 3, 2, 1, now. As a second negative speaker on the resolution, the proliferation of theory in high school parliament debate does more harm than good, I first want to shout out the novice debaters who are watching this round right now on YouTube. It may not be the day that this debate happens. It may be 10 years in the future. I have no idea. And I have no illusions of grandeur. This might be, have like 2 views. But for the 2 people who are watching this, congratulations. Great. I might not be the best at, theory. I might not be the best at critiques. I might not be the best at debate in general. But I can say that with my 4 years of experience, I have more than the novice who is watching this right now. That's important because when we look at proliferation, it's the passing on of knowledge from one generation of debaters to the next generation. It's from proliferation of knowledge from Michael and me to our baby varsity competitors who are sitting in this room right now, right? Parliamentary debate at Dougherty Valley High School. We have 2 coaches, but both of them are in LA. We have no coach with us at this tournament right now, except for Drew Baluja's mom, right? So all of these resources, we have no coaching resources at this tournament, and yet we are able to make it to finals. And why is that? It's because of the people in this room, all of the coaches, or at least most of the coaches in this room, have given us advice at one point or other in time. And that is because they also want to help us proliferate the knowledge of theory to high school parliament debate. Okay, let's get into the nature framework of today's resolution. The first thing is about, again, proliferation, which they accept. This means they accept the Cambridge definition. It's not rapidly spreading. Then moving on to the definition that really matters, it's this idea of, this idea of theory, sorry. Okay, so they talk about this idea of like critiques and how they're part of theory, but if you look at every single flow judge's paradigm, like they don't have theory and critique under the same subtitle. They have theory and critiques as different subtitles. And so inherently we see that there might be a difference between theory and critiques. Yes, first of 2 POIs.
Why do you rely on critiques so heavily in your responses to our case and saying that theory is good if you're going to turn around and tell us that critiques aren't even part of theory?
Actually, you'll notice that when we respond to that, we actually have 2 responses. The first one is about how even if they win on the critique definition, we still win that argument. But the second more important definition is that, even if they win on the critique argument, on the argument that critiques are theory, we still win that critiques in general are good and not silencing minorities, but actually increasing minorities. But the more important response there is that critiques are not part of critiques are not part of it. But so moving on, the negation arguments. The first negative argument is that of equity, right? So they talk about this idea about parent judges, meaning that checks back again equity. However, the truth is that parent judges are what we call lay judges, right? And that means that we have to adapt to these lay judges. That all teams alike need to be able to appeal to your common everyday citizen. And so that is one skill that we learn. But the second skill that we learn is the idea of theory, that at an advanced level, when we're advancing and looking at something like foreign policy at a high level, when we have the jargon to describe, not just to exclude, but not excluding at all, but to describe what is actually happening in that round in more efficient terms, then what happens is, in front of a flow judge, the people who actually know theory are doing better than the people who don't know theory. And given that theory is not going away in the status quo, and today's resolution isn't a referendum on whether theory is good or bad, we need to recognize that the proliferation of theory is necessary in order to do more good than harm today's actual high school parliamentary debate. They knock very loudly for this because they also don't really know parliamentary debate. It's long round. They also don't really know theory, right? But we also don't know all the ins and outs of theory. We're also still learning, right? The whole point of proliferation is so that in our process of learning, we can, become better at theory. Yes, just second of two POIs?
Sure.
Okay.
Given that it says does in the resolution, why are you talking about long term for Carly when does implies right now instead of will do or has done?
I don't know what that means. If you want, you can expand on that in your speech. It hasn't been brought up so far, and it probably can't be brought up in the next speech because it's AR. So moving on, the other main thing that they see here is that the idea of proliferation for novices not being as much. But again, recognize that people are watching the video right now on YouTube, right? Which means that probably that is going to be proliferation. Proliferation is good. Then moving on to contention number 2 about logic, and this is really cool because they don't refute to anything here. So that means you have to give this 100% probability under not theory rules, but just regular parliamentary debate rules. And if you look at this logic show, it tells you that the effective evaluation of theory gives you logic and increases the amount of education that you have in parliamentary debate, because it's not just topic-specific education we're talking about, it's real-world education. It's analysis of what's happening within the round. It's being self-conscious of, okay, where am I good and where am I bad? It's the strategic allocation of resources, whether it's time or money, or your resources at a small school or large school, and that is really, really important. Also, just making a response on small schools versus large schools and the amount of resources, realize that no matter how much resources you have, you're always going to need to read that resource in order to actually retain it in your brain and effectively use it within round. Which means that since the internet has an infinite amount of resources for you to read and implement within rounds, that probably means that there's the amount of time that's allocated is what's important instead of other things. Then moving on to the affirmative points. The first affirmative point is that of accessibility. So the first thing they say is that people that don't have theory and don't know theory won't do well in rounds. However, they are also in finals, and they admitted that they don't really know theory. So even at a basic level, it means that they probably have been doing well so far too. And here's the thing, right? It's that we have different methods of debating, but we shouldn't say that one is above the rest, right? Lay debate is really cool. I mostly do lay debate, right? But I recognize that in certain strategic opportunities, theory is also really, really important, especially in front of, for example, an all-flow panel. Then why wouldn't I use theory? I literally dropped at Long Beach because I didn't know, some theoretical arguments, right? So even if we can see that, okay, critiques, right? Then the proliferation of the actual argument that is, stand paradox or whatever to me would have benefited me more that if I had the proliferation happen there. And moving on to this idea of theory doesn't proliferate, that's not relevant to whether the proliferation of theory in high school debate does more harm than good. And also if theory does proliferate, just look at the example of how it actually does provide a safe environment about pronouns. So for example, there was a theory show about pronouns a couple years ago in high school parliamentary debate, where if you misgender someone because you assume that they are a certain gender and you use those pronouns, then that person who is currently feeling unsafe in round can take the opportunity to, instead of closing off and not being able to debate, actually read this pre-written theory shell and then be able to actually access the rest of the round because and be able to go on within the tournament. And this is important because when it comes to things like misgendering, there are no other alternatives within debate right now. And that's really especially important when we look at the D rule case that we brought up before, which is the case of Nueva XS, where they use this example of suicide impacts to give them the round. Then on to education, realize that if you can't access the round, you can't access education. So accessibility controls education. But then on 3 about Harley, they talk about this idea of there's new arguments that need to be made, and but they drop that proof negates the need for this. So go to Google if you really want to do so, and also norms can change. They don't really talk about this at all. So also extend disadvantage to you.
guess already that by all the knocking they were doing during the last speech, they're going to come up here and they're going to hammer into your brain for 5 minutes, theory is exclusionary. The thing is, they concede that theory is here to stay. Let's look at the tense of the resolution. Does. Theory is here to stay. That goes conceded throughout today's round. That's because of NPA judges, and that's because of other events. Since theory is here to stay, that means that essentially we've got 2 options. 1, theory doesn't proliferate. And that means that the teams that know theory can use it and can win rounds off it. Or we have option 2. Theory does proliferate and we give equitable access to more people. Unless we have the proliferation of theory, equity gets destroyed. And when they concede that theory is here to stay in the parliamentary debate space, then ultimately they need to prove how the proliferation of theory is bad for equity. And I don't think they've done that in today's round. But moving on to sort of the individual argumentation. First, on the equity arguments on both of them. Right? The issue with the equity arguments is that, again, they drop that theory is here to stay. Since theory is here to stay, they drop the theory is here to stay. They drop that the only way to engage with theory is by understanding theory. Since the only way to engage with theory is by understanding theory, and both of us agree that theory is an a priori issue, what that means is that if theory doesn't proliferate, people can't engage with the round. They have no chance of winning. They just lose. That means people don't participate in debate. Since theory is here to stay, the best way to give more people access to the debate space is by having theory proliferate. Because, again, I'm repeating this a bunch of times, but theory is here to stay. They never argue against that, and they can't do that in their next speech. Furthermore, and just generally, adaptation to different styles of debate provides different skills to debaters. So even if somehow they do get around the argument that theory is here to stay, what we can see is that the adaptation to different styles of debate will provide different skills to debaters that benefit them in different ways. They pretty much completely drop the argument about logic, where it's that simply understanding the interactions between the different layers of theory, that provides an education in understanding logic and understanding resource allocation, where that's a unique kind of education to theory. So you can flow that through. On to the app case. So they might come up here again and talk about this whole case thing, but really it's just that we're covering our bases, right? We don't think Ks are theory, but we're giving responses in case Ks are considered theory. So this isn't us putting ourselves in a double bind, this is ourselves covering our bases here. Okay, on the individual arguments, right, the key thing about theory is that it's not only key at allowing everyone to access the debate space by putting everyone on the equal footing, but it's also the D rule, where it's that the D rule allows people to shape the debate space such that it enables them to access it. This is uniquely key because this allows more voices into the debate space and provides more education. In terms of contention 2 about education, what we can see is that, as my partner mentioned, contention 2 is controlled by contention 1. So if they don't win contention 1, they can't go for contention 2. But furthermore, we can see that theory and topicality is the only way to limit the AF to the topic, right? They don't really give a good response to this. If we can't limit the AF to the topic, then we kill clash, we kill education. As my partner mentioned on contention 3, they drop the public forum as a viable alternative if you just don't want to deal with theory, and that norms can change. And I specifically said they need to prove why it's bad for this norm to change. They did. So, sort of impact calculus on the whole and just looking at it. We can see that the main issue of today's round is going to be that of equity. Because theory is here to stay, and because they never give you a reason why theory isn't here to stay, the only way in which we can provide equitable access to theory is by having theory proliferate. If theory doesn't proliferate, then we run into the scenario that they complain about, where certain teams have the ability to just win rounds, and other teams don't have any access at all. So in order to preserve equity, we need to have the proliferation of theory. So because of that, the proliferation of theory does not do more harm than good. I urge a strong neg ballot.
Okay, everybody good? I want to make one thing clear right at the top of the case. They hinge their entire case on the idea that theory will eventually become everywhere, will become omnipresent, and therefore it's going to be best if everyone just gets on board and gets used to it. The fundamental flaw in this is that our entire first contention and the basis of most of our argument is that new teams don't have access to theory. And it doesn't matter how much theory spreads through the debate, it doesn't matter if everyone who does debate knows theory, new teams are not going to enter debate because of how exclusive it is, because of how jargony it is, and how hard it is to get involved, which means less kids do debate, and most of us like debate here today. So with that, we're going to get into our first voting issue, which is that of education. Number one, this outweighs everything else in the round. Even if you believe that a theory will extend to every other debater, they have fundamentally conceded that theory X's education. They have fundamentally conceded that when we talk about theory, we are not learning about things that are important to the real world, which means that even if theory were to spread everywhere, which we disagree that it will, it doesn't happen on the East Coast, it doesn't happen in Southern California, it doesn't happen in Oregon, we can clearly see that that would be a bad thing, that losing of education that debate provides and that so few other things really provide as extracurricular activities in our world outweighs everything else. If debate is not about education, why are we here? Why are we doing it? There's no point to us doing it. So with that, we move to our second issue here, which is that of long term. The things that we learn in debate, and this goes completely conceded by the negation in today's round, the things that we learn in debate that will help us in our lives are not what a T-shell is. It's not what competing interpretations means. I don't know what that means. It's not what topicality means or what a critique means. The things that will help us in debate is a broader understanding of our world that makes us more informed, more understanding, and more empathetic citizens that can actually change things and do good for our world. Those things don't come from theory. You lose those completely even if you believe that theory will eventually become everywhere. And we know that even if theory becomes everywhere, it still won't be equitable because new schools won't be able to access it without a huge amount of coaching, which they concede. Finally, and this takes out their entire case, they concede that parley only is conducive to bad theory. Because we have a system of debate that says that you are going to prep only for 20 minutes. If you run a K in a round, if you run topicality in a round, it's done in a way that you've pre-prepared and you're trying to fit it to the resolution, which means that any potential gains that come from theory when they talk about logic, when they talk about things like that, don't exist because theory is done badly in parley. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the framing to do it well.
Would you stop the time the application of theory is done badly to debate in parley to the logic argumentation is not done before this speech and should not be done?
So, two responses here. Number one, my partner responded to the logic contention in his speech. Number two, I'm weighing 2 points that have been throughout this round. That's the purpose of the final speech. But up to judge interpretation, or discretion, that's what it's called. Okay, so with that, we are going to get into our second voting issue in today's round, which is that of exclusion. We agree, accessibility has to be the most important thing. The idea that every individual should have access to debate equally. The problem is, even if every school does theory, that means that new schools don't have the resources to do theory, and it's not equitable or accessible to everyone. This goes completely conceded by our opponents. And furthermore, we argue that theory, since it says does in the resolution, as I point out in the POI, and as my opponents affirm, we're talking about right now. We're talking about what theory does right now in the status quo as we speak, which means that it is more important what theory is doing right now, and theory hasn't proliferated everywhere. There will always be schools that are better at theory and know more theory, and schools that know less theory. And since they have told us throughout this round that schools that know less theory lose on the basis of knowing less theory, our opponents give an example from SCU, I can give an example from TOC, all of us have lost because we don't know enough theory. We can clearly see that that is exclusionary. That means that people aren't doing well in debate, they aren't having access to the activity in the same way because there are different levels of theory accessible to individuals. It will never be completely equal because nothing will ever be completely equal in debate, and furthermore, it will never be completely equal for new programs, for programs that don't have access to coaching, for programs that are trying to figure out what the heck debate is. The real only response here that we hear from them here is about APTA judges. They tell you, well, maybe APTA judges are making debate more problematic. Who judges most debate rounds? Parents. If we're concerned about education, if we're concerned about debate being good, if we're concerned about having accurate judging, it shouldn't be conducted in a way that makes it so that parents can't understand what's going on because they don't spend 2 hours a week after school learning about theory like the rest of us do. And we don't even learn about theory. So we're saying that it's going to be completely exclusionary if we focus on it that way. Finally, what this debate boils down to is the fact that theory will never be accessible for everyone. And everyone in this round agrees that unless we live in a world where every single baby pops into this world knowing what theory is, knowing what a T-shell is, and being able to do debate, theory is not accessible, which ultimately means that there is not education happening. They concede that theory is not done well in parley, which means the theory that does happen isn't good for education, and they concede that theory gets rid of all education conversation and debate, in which case, why are we all here in the first place? So for all those reasons, the proliferation of theory and parliamentary debate has been bad. None more harm.